This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I'm not sure if it's yours, but I love it, so hopefully the enthusiasm will be contagious. Okay, so we started briefly talking about neurotransmitters last time, and we know that what neurotransmitters, of course, all have in common is that they are all released from a neuron right next to the receptor, okay? So what we're going to have to do is, in this set of notes and the endocrine set of notes, there is some memorization that goes with your thinking. So you have different categories of neurotransmitters that you have to memorize. You need to memorize which category they're in chemically, what receptor they bond to. So I'm going to try to organize it for you. But first, generally when you're talking about neurotransmitters, they are going to have some things in common in addition to the way that they're released. Most neurotransmitters are relatively small, by which I mean they are relatively low molecular weight. Now, I'm not expecting you to memorize the molecular structure of them, but I do want you to acknowledge that if you tried, you could count all the atoms, right? And why does it matter that they're relatively small? Because that means they diffuse across the synapse relatively quickly, right? And their release and reuptake mechanism is not as complicated as it would be if they were like an enormous protein. Okay, so that's a neurotransmitter. Here's some more. They're all mostly about the size of an amino acid with the exception of the biggest ones. Here's the biggest ones. Even the biggest ones, and these are like, this is a beta endorphin, which is an opioid. This one's still much smaller than like a protein, right? So it's still relatively small. So they're relatively small. They are fast acting, and usually there's more than one receptor subtype. So here's something that is conceptually a little hard to grasp, but if I tell you, for instance, that a neurotransmitter is excitatory, I'm kind of fibbing to you, because a neurotransmitter isn't anything. It's the receptor that causes the response, right? So if I say a neurotransmitter like dopamine is excitatory, what I mean is it usually binds to and opens an excitatory channel, right? So it's usually going to cause depolarization. But does that mean that dopamine cannot be inhibitory elsewhere in the body? It certainly can, right? Because really the response is generated by the receptor. It's not generated by the neurotransmitter, right? Okay, so what we will do is we'll sort of memorize whether they're generally excitatory or generally inhibitory and that kind of stuff, but realize that there can always be exceptions because the response to any chemical messenger is tissue specific. Depends on what receptors the tissue has. Good? Okay, so what we are going to do is we're going to sort of, so I'm going to be throwing a bunch of information about neurotransmitters at you, but I want you to be listening so that you'll know how to organize your study for a few things that you will usually figure out about the neurotransmitter. I'm not saying that you'll have the answers for every one of them, but instead of just me telling you one story after another about the neurotransmitter, these are the things that you should be listening for. So listen for its chemical category. That's how they are originally organized. And I know a lot of us hate chemistry. You're not the only one. The reason this chemistry would be important is because neurotransmitters that are chemically similar get categorized together, and sometimes drugs act on all of them, or they have a similar reuptake mechanism or a similar breakdown mechanism. So the chemistry actually does matter, right? So if norepinephrine and dopamine and epinephrine are all in the same chemical category, then you can probably understand how a drug might be able to mess with both of them simultaneously. Okay? So it's at least relevant. It's not fun, but it's at least relevant. And then listen to whether they are CNS, PNS, or both. Okay? So a neurotransmitter that is CNS would be within the brain or the spinal cord. Those are the ones that are most interesting to me, but not surprisingly, they are the ones that we know most about. Because I can, for instance, mess with my PNS neurotransmitters, ones that works between a neuron and a skeletal muscle cell, without killing myself or making myself crazy. I can experiment on mice and rats and humans with PNS neurotransmitters. But with CNS neurotransmitters, you've got a lot less information, although they're the most interesting part of the story. So they CNS, PNS, or both. Are they excitatory or inhibitory? Or sometimes both. Inhibitory. What are the receptors called? And there's one more thing, huh? I was like, why are there not 5? Biologists are the scientists that are the worst at math. So no, 1 through 3. I'm definitely not a physicist. Okay, and then the last one is any clinical connection. So obviously when we're talking about serotonin, we'll be talking about SSRIs, that kind of stuff, right? Okay, so let's start. So the first way that you do these, organize them, is the way that your textbook does. So we're going to build something like this. So these are the chemical categories. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this one is just other stuff, like we don't know how to categorize it. So we're going to do it the same way. We're going to categorize these based on their chemistry, and then you will understand a little bit more about their functionality. So the first ones are called the choline derivatives, but there's only one that you have to know. You probably don't know what choline is. I didn't know for a long time. Choline is a water-soluble B vitamin nutrient. And so the neurotransmitter is going to be based on this nutrient. So let me show you what acetylcholine looks like. This is the only choline derivative that you have to learn, although it's not the only one that exists. Where are you, acetylcholine? Okay, this is acetylcholine, and these are its breakdown molecules. So it's about the size of amino acid. It's not exactly like an amino acid, but it's about that same size. So the one that you're going to have to know is acetylcholine, which is very often abbreviated ACH. This is the neurotransmitter that we know the most about and have known the most about for the longest. It was the first one we found. And the reason it's the first one we found is because it is the most abundant P and S neurotransmitter. So it is used between neurons and every single skeletal muscle cell, right? So there's lots of opportunities to see it acting, right? You can stimulate a neuron to release acetylcholine, watch what it does on skeletal muscle. You can inhibit the activity. You can use agonists and antagonists, and you can really see the functionality. So first identified, best understood. Let's talk about some of the functionalities of that one. So it is a common neurotransmitter. It's usually excitatory. And I'm not saying that because I don't know the answer. I'm saying it because in most places it binds to an excitatory receptor. Okay, so its PNS function, you probably learned something about its PNS function, or maybe a little bit in anatomy, I don't know. Every single neuron that stimulates skeletal muscle uses acetylcholine. And so that's the somatic nervous system. Does that sound familiar to you? Somatic nervous system is skeletal muscle, controlling skeletal muscle. And then the autonomic nervous system, which is controlling cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Half of the autonomic nervous system uses acetylcholine as well. So really like ubiquitous in controlling muscular and glandular activity. Okay, and then in addition to its PNS function, which you may be familiar with, it also has a CNS function. And acetylcholine is used in the central nervous system for short-term memory formation, okay? And that should reinforce what we said about nicotine last time. Do you remember us talking about nicotine and how nicotine is an acetylcholine agonist? Where central nervous system is the primary place that you like its activity, although it does have PNS functions as well. Is that okay? So we'll get back to that when we come to the clinical connections. So let's talk about terminology. So there has to be a quick way to say that this entire story up here deals with acetylcholine, okay? And the quick way to say that is to say that the synapse, this receptor, this presynaptic and postsynaptic cell are cholinergic. The suffix ergic means related to. So now I don't have to say, when I'm talking about this, the synapse makes, bonds to, releases, and breaks down acetylcholine, because I can just say it's cholinergic. So the receptor is cholinergic, and the synapse is cholinergic. So cholinergic receptors, cholinergic synapses. So let's talk briefly about those synapses. The synapse will also be considered cholinergic. So there are two types of acetylcholine receptors that are really commonly encountered. And the cholinergic, they're both cholinergic, but there's two subtypes. And the reason I want to tell you this is because we're going to run into them all semester long. And it also tells you something about the history of why the hell the naming is so weird with neurotransmitters. So conceptually, we usually discover a drug before we discover a receptor, and then we discover the receptor before we discover the neurotransmitter. So just think about opium, right? Did people wait until we understood opioid receptors before they started smoking opium? Hell no, because they were bored way back then, too. So opium has been used for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. I can't remember whether it's hundreds or thousands of years. Hundreds to 1,000 years. It's been used for a really long time. And so what happens is we become fascinated with something because we can see that it has an impact on the brain, right? And then science evolves to the point that we can start investigating protein receptors. And then we find the receptor. Instead of calling the receptor like something related to its chemistry, we call it an opioid receptor, right? And then only later do we figure out that, oh, okay, if you have a receptor for it, you probably got something internally that is released to bind to the receptor, right? And then generally what we do later on is we find what we call the endogenous chemical, which is the one that you make, okay? So the reason I'm bringing this up is because the receptors for nicotine, obviously we used nicotine long before we actually found acetylcholine. The receptors for nicotine and acetylcholine are called nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Because what do they bind? Nicotine and acetylcholine, right? And we've known about those for a really long time, and they're a bunch of different places in the body. And then the other ones, you might not have heard of these, but these were found because poisons like to interact at receptors. And there's a poison, a mushroom poison called muscarine that was just killing people dead. They're like, why the hell is everybody dying? It's a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. So they named that one because it binds to a mushroom poison called muscarine and acetylcholine. Okay. So as we go through this semester, we will revisit nicotinic and muscarinic receptors because you have nicotinic on skeletal muscle and muscarinic in different places, those places in the body. Okay. Now, it may seem irrelevant to learn much about receptors, but can you conceptualize that as soon as you start going into anything related to pharmacology, it's one receptor story after another. It's figuring out how I can interact with the receptor and block its activity or enhance its activity, right? Or does this drug act at this group of receptors versus that group of receptors, right? And if you can limit it so that it only acts at nicotinic receptors, then you're not going to get the side effects from muscarinic receptors, right? So the receptor sort of specificity idea comes back here. Okay, so let's talk about clinical connections related to acetylcholine. As we mentioned, since acetylcholine is used in the CNS for short-term memory formation, it probably won't surprise you that it is also related to Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's represents in its full manifestation, up to a 90% loss of acetylcholine in the short-term memory formation parts of the brain. What we don't completely understand is what's the cause and what's the effect. We know that it's related to sleep. We know that you end up with about a 90% reduction in acetylcholine. We don't know whether the receptors degenerate and then you lose the acetylcholine, whether you lose the acetylcholine because of neurons can't make it anymore, because it's not being replenished. We don't know. Go ahead. I mean, it just weigh it out. You can, right? But it's only a small effect anyway. It's a really small, short-term, acute effect that you would have to sort of repetitively activate. And of course, the problems with nicotine delivery create their own set of problems associated with it. Go ahead.
So not all acetylcholine receptors are nicotinic?
No, they're not. So there's nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. Yeah. So go ahead.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. So we have acetylcholine receptors all over the place, but then only some of them.
Only some of them have to do with memory, and those are the nicotinic ones that have to do with memory in the brain. So nicotine doesn't seem to be an effective treatment, although it does cause like momentary sort of relief from the Alzheimer's symptoms. It doesn't stop the progression at all. Alzheimer's represents up to a 90% loss of acetylcholine in certain brain areas. I keep trying to remember to tell you this. The new cadaver that we have on Jordan campus died of Alzheimer's related disease. So I really want to get his brain out to see, because it actually causes degeneration of gray matter and white matter in the brain, and I wonder if we can actually see it like gross anatomically. So I'm just telling you this so that you can remember to tell me. Okay, and then so nicotine is an acetylcholine agonist, right? And then have you guys ever heard of the poison curare? What? Oh, I did tell you about it. Okay, so curare is plant derived, and it's used South and Central America. And so let's say I want to eat a monkey, because people eat monkeys, or I want to like take down some big animal that I don't want to chase. What the hell's down there? I keep thinking wildebeest, but that's Africa, so I don't know. I'm terrible at geography. There's some down there that I want to chase, and I want to eat it, okay? So what you can do is you can use this plant-derived poison that is an acetylcholine antagonist, and you can put it on your dart or your arrow, and you like blow it up at the monkey, thunk, and then the monkey falls out of the tree, and then you get monkey meat. Or you can take down the whatever South American equivalent of a wildebeest. Capybara? No, those are too cute to eat. Okay, I don't know, huh? So, and it has a really short half-life, so it actually gets out of the tissue relatively readily, and it's a poison, and people now kill each other with it, because we kill each other with everything that we can possibly find to kill each other. I'm not sure we like each other that much. So that's curare. And this tells me that you guys did not read enough mystery novels growing up, because I read every single Agatha Christie novel by the time I was 11. And so then I just got obsessed with how to kill people. Okay. All right. So biogenic amines are next. So choline derivatives, and then the next category is the biogenic amines. And these are the ones that's kind of complicated to keep the story straight with them. So with biogenic amines, here's what I want to tell you. They were in their recent memory an amino acid, but we changed them slightly so that they couldn't be used as part of a protein anymore. So let me show you what I mean. So with biogenic amines, okay, amino acids, okay. Now, if I change them just slightly so that I couldn't use them as an amino acid or as an amino acid as part of a protein anymore, just by adding a hydroxyl group or breaking a bond or something, they're still about the size of an amino acid, but I couldn't use them as a protein anymore. So they're called biogenic amines, and they're derived from amino acids, but you can't use them. And we have some other ones that you actually are just straight amino acids. So let's talk about these. So they are derived from amino acids. The first category that we're going to look at is derived from tyrosine. So let's look. So this category is called the catecholamines. And it includes some of your favorite neurotransmitters. These are derived from tyrosine. So really what I want you to look at when you look at these is just look at how similar the structures of all of the ones that are derived from tyrosine are. Look, so that's an intermediate, but look at these three: dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Look how similar the structure is of all three of those. So once we get into it, you will probably not be surprised that sometimes all three of them can use a similar reuptake mechanism. Two of them can use a similar breakdown mechanism. They have a lot in common with each other, and they're all derived and very similar in structure. So these are called the catecholamines. And the catecholamines include two of your favorites, and these two right here, dopamine and norepinephrine. And these are your three favorite neurotransmitters. You didn't know you have favorites, but you do, because these are the reason you favorite things. So let's talk a little bit about dopamine's functionality, and then we'll talk about norepinephrine's functionality. Dopamine is going to be the first one that we cover. And dopamines, to give you a nugget to remember what dopamine does, it's mostly CNS, okay? And dopamine is your hell yes, let's do that again neurotransmitter. It's your reward and reinforcement neurotransmitter. Evolutionarily, the function of dopamine is to tell you that that thing that you just did, you really like it, so you should do it again. So you release it when you eat, you release dopamine. You release it when you have sex. You release it when you do something that is pro-survival or pro-species. So it's an evolutionary reinforcement chemical. And so not surprisingly, evolutionarily reinforcement should feel like pleasure, correct? So that you will seek it out again. So this is a very, very pleasant chemical that is released, as long as it's released in normal amounts. When it's released in high amounts, it jacks you up. So it's reward and motivation. That's one of the functions. So functions mostly CNS, used in the brain for motivation, reinforcement, and reward pathway. There's this pathway that goes through the middle of your brain, the limbic system and the nucleus accumbens, which reinforces behavior. Now, when we come to this one and we look at the functionality, you can start to understand why any drug that you take that taps into the dopamine pathway, A, will be very, very pleasant, and B, will tell you you need more in the future, right? That makes sense? So typically speaking, drugs that tap into the dopamine pathway tend to be the drugs that are most predisposed to chemical habit formation and addiction, okay? So why the hell would you use them? A, super duper fun, awesome, like feel like pleasure, right? And B, a whole category of these are also the most powerful pain relievers we have that just happen to tap into the dopamine pathways. And which one are those? Which ones? Yeah, opioids, yeah. Opioids, their neurotransmitter activity is actually with like opioids, but they tap into the dopamine pathway and reinforce the behavior. So any drug that really taps in heavily to the dopamine pathway is likely to be a drug of habit formation and abuse. And so what are some others in addition to the opioids that you would imagine tap into this really readily? Cocaine, methamphetamine, those kinds of things tap into this pathway. Other things tap into it, but not very completely and very variably between people. Like alcohol does cause a little bit of the dopamine pathway, but not the same amount in a lot of people. It's not really dependable. It's highly variable from person to person. So does everyone who drinks a cocktail get addicted? No? But do you know any really successful heroin stories? Me neither. You do? You know a successful heroin story? No, I mean, no, well, I mean, like, I tried heroin once or twice, no big deal. No. Yeah, so, yeah, it's really taps into the dopamine pathway really massively. I will tell you about a little branch of research that's being studied right now, which I find fascinating. So, obviously, there's variability between people and their predisposition to addiction, right? So, what is the basis of the variability? It seems as if one of the strongest areas of research is suggesting that the basis of variability has to do with your inherent level of dopamine that you're generally releasing. So let's say you and I both get an opioid prescription for dental work, surgery, whatever the hell, and we take it as directed, right? And one of us ends up addicted to opioids and the other one doesn't. What's the difference? Well, there could be a million differences. But let's say we're identical twins. What they think the difference might be is your inherent predisposition to how much dopamine you release on a regular basis. So let's say I release regularly relatively large amounts of dopamine. Like it's just part of my brain chemistry that I release decent amounts of dopamine. And then I take a drug that taps into the dopamine pathway, and my body's like, that's kind of cool. You know, not that different. Right, but you release relatively low levels of dopamine on a regular basis, and then you take a drug that taps into the dopamine pathway, and you're like, OMG, please, more, frequently, right? And it's not just you that's saying it, it's your brain that's saying it. It's your brain that's saying, please give me more of that, and give it to me frequently. And then, of course, the next thing that happens, of course, is you start downregulating your receptors, right, because of massive quantities of things that tap into the dopamine. And then you're not going to have the same response with the same level. Right? And then you can get into the situation in which you, let's say you were on opioids and then you get off of opioids and you're off for 6 months, and then you have a day in which you just decide to do it again. What doesn't calculate into the recovering addict's brain, but should calculate into a physiologist's brain, is that 6 months is enough time to regenerate your receptors.
That's when people die.
Yeah, that's how people die, almost invariably. So it's when you go off and then you go back on, and then you think that the amount that you took when you went off is the amount that you need to take. Yeah.
My cousin died from heroin overdose. So
Yeah, I've got.
After 6 months of sobriety.
Yeah, it's a really common story, and I think that education can do a little bit to help with that. So if you have people in your family who are opiate users, some of them started out because of pain, right? So we, right? Yeah, pain meds. And heroin's like cheaper than beer.
So much cheaper.
And easier to get, really. Yeah, you don't need an ID, last time I checked.
Probably
So,
better if you don't.
as a matter of fact, you can't have my ID when I'm doing a heroin deal. But yeah, in addition to like being highly variable about the amount that's actually in the dose, once you go off and you've upregulated your receptors again, then that same level will actually depress your respiration and stop breathing. Go ahead.
So is that, I mean, does that have something to do with the amount of dopamine that's dumped, or is it when somebody's reusing after those that
It has to do, it has to do with the sensitivity of your receptors.
of all the receptors?
Yes, of all of your receptors. Not, it's really the opioid
But your
receptors.
CNS.
The dopamine is what makes you want to do it, but the opioids are actually what depresses your nervous system. So we haven't talked about
So
opioid
all
activity.
the receptors downregulated.
Yes, all of the receptors are downregulated.
So would that be why people who are clinically like depressed are more susceptible to becoming addicted to these kind of drugs?
I'm sure that it has something to do with it, but I doubt the relationship is that simple. Because a lot of people just try to self-medicate with almost any kind of chemical if they've got some kind of mental difference that they are. Go ahead.
What are methadone clinics for?
Wait until we get to opioids so that we can talk about methadone. Okay, so we're still talking about dopamine here. What?
There was like a heroin user that was going on everything if you get the pill.
Oh, yeah. It is, I'll tell you about methadone when we get to opioids, but we're not there yet. Go ahead.
So pain medications like Dilaudid and morphine would be like dopamine.
No. Okay, so here's the deal. Their mechanism of pain relief, of analgesic, is based on their opioid activity. But their mechanism of addiction is because they tap into the dopamine pathway. So not surprisingly, there are chemicals that interact with more than one neurotransmitter. Those are particularly problematic because in addition to being able to, for instance, turn off your respiratory system, they also make you seek the drug out, right? And then downregulate your receptors, so you're going to need more of the drug. So it's interesting. We are fourth in the nation for opioid use. For opioid deaths. We have outrageously high, we are first in the nation for use of anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication. We are fourth in the nation for opioid overdose. We have almost every addiction problem with the exception of we're really low in alcohol addiction compared to the other states. Go ahead.
This is kind of off topic, but I was listening to the radio as I was driving here a couple days ago, and they were talking about how they're going to have safe spaces at clinics in Washington State to take your opioids and like do medical drugs, but like I don't know how that really works or not.
I don't know. It's going to be an interesting thing.
They're going to do it no matter what.
Yeah, they are.
They're going to do the drugs.
So I don't know if a safe space would really make it, but they're like so.
I love these public health discussions. I find them really fascinating, and I love that you're thinking about them. But you know that we're not going to agree, right? But I highly recommend that you talk to people who disagree with you. It's really good for your argument. Really is. I mean, that's why I live in Utah, right? Nobody agrees with me about anything, right? Super good for me. I have like incredibly well-formed arguments because I always have to defend my position. Go ahead.
So people that are like addicted to opiates, like after 6 months, could they actually still have pain, or when they come to the doctor, they just really want the opioid at that time?
Oh yeah, they can totally have pain. Yeah. So wait until you guys are fascinated with opioids, but you have to hold on because opioids happen on Tuesday. Okay. So dopamine receptors are dopaminergic. They are generally the D1 and D2 receptors. If I remember correctly, I think the ones that are so related to habit formation are D2. So if you can find a drug that reduces pain and doesn't interact with your D2 receptors, you got a golden drug, but we are still looking for that golden ticket. It hasn't really happened yet. Okay, clinical connection, of course, addiction, but also schizophrenia. Fascinatingly, really, really high levels of dopamine released in parts of the brain can actually cause schizophrenia. Parkinson's disease is loss of dopamine in that motor portion of the brain called the substantia nigra. It's not related to addiction. It's a totally different part of the brain. But Parkinson's disease is also related to dopamine. Okay, so now let's move on to some of your other favorite chemicals. And so dopamine is like a hell yes and a high five. And then norepinephrine and epinephrine Do you know the other names for do you know the other names for these?
Adrenaline.
Adrenaline and noradrenaline, yeah. If you were British, that's what you would call them. Okay, so let's talk about them collectively. As far as the difference between them, they are super duper similar chemically, so let me just show you. And you probably won't be surprised that they actually interact mostly with the same receptors. So here's the difference between these two. It's just a little methyl group right here, primarily, the difference between those two. So generally, if you have a norepinephrine receptor, it interacts with epinephrine. Sometimes it has greater affinity for one or the other, but they usually just get lumped together. Okay, so CNS functions and then PNS functions. So the reason you probably know about epinephrine without having done much brain functionality is that epinephrine and norepinephrine are your fight or flight chemicals for the PNS. Does that sound familiar? Adrenaline, epinephrine. So they have PNS functionality that you probably learned a little bit about in anatomy. For instance, there are receptors on the heart, right? Receptors on the smooth muscle of your blood vessels. They can change blood flow patterns, increase heart rate, all that kind of stuff. And just so you know, it doesn't matter actually whether they're released as a neurotransmitter or released as a hormone. They get there and do the same thing. So those are PNS functions. But now let's talk about CNS functions. So the CNS functions are not limited to fight or flight. You actually use this far more frequently than just fight or flight with the CNS. So the CNS functions are, if this is a hell yes and a high five, this is, I'm awake, right? I'm paying attention, I got this, right? This is alertness, concentration, and energy, okay? So let's talk about antidepressants. We talked about serotonin-related antidepressants. We'll talk about them again in just a second. But in addition, another way, so if this is your completely delightful, ideal Venn diagram of being both happy, relatively chilled out, and really competent, then this is exactly where you want to be. I think I might have been there once, maybe. I don't know, for like a couple minutes. So most of us are not there and don't stay there. For, you know, and if you are, nobody wants to hang out with you anyway because you're too damn normal. We can't identify with one another. But one of the ways that they can treat depression, in addition to just regulating your serotonin, which is a really common way to do it because it actually sort of chills you out and helps you deal with the bumps and bruises of life, is, Wellbutrin does these two. Wellbutrin is a norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake inhibitor. Can you see how that might give you a different type of relief from depression? If you both have more pleasure in your life and you're more up and alert, okay, it feels entirely different coming from a position of person who's taking both of them. Like, I am constantly trying to figure out what the hell my brain's going to do. SSRIs, to me, this is just anecdotal evidence, feel like everything's cool, but I don't really give a crap about much, right? I don't want to have sex. I don't care if I gain 40 pounds. You said something rude to me, and I'm probably not going to battle you about it, right? Totally cool. Everything's fine. And sometimes that's what you need. Wellbutrin, bupropion, works with those two, and it's much more up. It doesn't have the same side effects because it doesn't interact with serotonin. But can you see that it would be more likely to cause sleeplessness and anxiety because of the way that it behaves? So although it's a good antidepressant for some people, it's terrible for an anti-anxiety medication. It's contraindicated for anti-anxiety. It can actually bring on panic attacks for anxiety. Does that make sense to you guys? So norepinephrine is alertness, concentration, and energy. And if someone is really, really treatment resistant, they can use all three types of antidepressants simultaneously. Wellbutrin and SSRIs, or something related to Wellbutrin and SSRIs. Okay, so norepinephrine and epinephrine. So the terminology that goes with these is a little counterintuitive, but again, if I tell you the history, it'll make more sense. So, of course, epinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline, right? And the reason adrenaline was called adrenaline is because we found it in the bloodstream first. It's easier to find hormones than it is to find neurotransmitters. And we tracked it back to the adrenal glands, and then we labeled everything that bound to it adrenergic, right? That makes sense? Okay, so they didn't change the names once they figured out that it was also a neurotransmitter. So now everything that binds to norepinephrine or epinephrine, all of the synapses that deal with it. So if we use this figure and we say that this is releasing norepinephrine or epinephrine, responding to it, this is all considered adrenergic. That's the way that you say it. Good? Okay, so it's just a short way of saying it. Okay, so all of the catecholamines, all three of these, has some things in common. Sometimes these two use a similar reuptake mechanism. Sometimes these two do, and sometimes they use the same breakdown mechanism just because they're so similar in chemistry. So a lot of times if you have drugs that deal with one of them, it'll deal with all three of them or two of the three. Okay, so one of the things I want you to imagine right now is there's two different ways of getting these catecholamines out of the synapse. In some synapses, you reuptake them. Okay, you guys with me? In some synapses, you break them down. One of the enzymes that can break down catecholamines is monoamine oxidase. Okay, so just keep that in mind for just a second. Okay, so now let's talk about clinical connections. We already talked about Wellbutrin, which is bupropion, is a norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake inhibitor. It's used as an antidepressant. It doesn't have the same side effects as SSRIs. It doesn't have sexual dysfunction side effects, but it can make you not sleep, which can cause its own degrees of problems. Another set of antidepressants, which we mentioned last time, but I want to revisit, is the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So if this is MAO, right, monoamine oxidase, the enzyme that breaks down all three of these, okay, you can use an MAOI, monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which will allow them to stay in the synapse longer and provide relief from depression. So those are really effective in treatment-resistant depressions, but hardly ever used because you have to be careful about everything you eat, drink, and ingest with them. So they are usually used inpatient, not outpatient. Does that make sense? When you can make sure that someone is not eating a certain amino acid, a cheese, wine, so you have to be really careful about those. So good for treatment-resistant depression, but like if you thought like celiac disease was bad, right? This is like you have to be completely aware of everything, the chemistry and everything that you eat. And most people are just not up to that. It's like worse than being a diabetic, right? You'd have to be really well educated too to know how to take care of yourself and not kill yourself. It causes like seizures if you take in something that you're not supposed to take with the MAOIs. So that's MAOIs. Okay, two examples of those are Nardil and Marplan. Okay, so let's talk about the other biogenic amines. So they're not catecholamines, and serotonin is the next one. It's derived from a different amino acid. Serotonin is derived from tryptophan. So, yeah, yeah. Okay. So let's look at serotonin real quick.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So V and like Nora V and Epi are really similar in composition. Will they have a similar action?
Yeah, very, very frequently they will interact at the same receptor and have the same action. Just to collect, I mean, this is an oversimplification, but this one is more ubiquitous in the peripheral nervous system, and this one is more ubiquitous in the central nervous system. But they usually do very similar things, higher affinity sometimes for one than the other. But yeah, I usually just lump them together, norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay, so this is serotonin. And serotonin, notice it has a chemical structure that's different enough that you can imagine that it won't activate the same receptors as these, right? Okay, so this is serotonin. Sorry, that's dopamine. Where are you, serotonin? I lost you. That's serotonin. Okay, so that's serotonin. Serotonin is derived from the amino acid tryptophan. And what it really is, for those of you who care about the chemistry, and I know some of you just freaking hate that I keep showing chemistry pictures, but what the hell else am I going to show in here, right? Like, it doesn't make for good pictures. What serotonin is actually 5-hydroxytryptophan. And for those of you who know a little chemistry, all you do is slap a hydroxyl group on the 5-carbon. So it's just like tryptophan with a hydroxyl group there. Okay, so what are the functions of serotonin? Yes, serotonin does so many different things. It's mostly a CNS neurotransmitter. It's important in the entire brain, but here are as disparate as its functions are. It is used in the entire brain, both the cerebral cortex and also the brainstem. It regulates sleep and emotion in some of the deeper portions of your brain. It regulates sensory and motor function in the brainstem and other portions of your brain, but it also regulates hunger, mood, sex drive, anxiety, depression, obsession, compulsion, and memory. So, if you want to medicate something related to serotonin receptors, you better be very selective. Do you see? Because it's not like I am so depressed that I want to take a drug that makes me hallucinate, right? That makes sense? Because if it actually impacts sensory function, then it can actually, you can have hallucinogenic drugs that are serotonin related. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so when you are looking at serotonin receptors, and we'll get to the clinical connections in just a second, a serotonin receptor is either called Serotoninergic or sometimes 5-HT-ergic, because it's 5-hydroxytryptophan. Why am I telling you all of this? Not so much that you can rote memorize it all, but so that you could open a PDR, a physician's desk reference, and it says, this is a 5-HT-ergic antagonist, right? And then you're like, I am the smartest person I know, because I know what the hell that means. And you want to like make more of those situations happen in your future, right? You want to be the smartest person in the room, and then you want to go to a different room, right? And then try to be the smartest person in that room. And if you are, you should leave. You've got to keep learning from people. My husband's really smart. I'm hardly ever the smartest person in the room, damn it. Okay, so let's talk about clinical connections. So the first things we've already talked about. SSRIs, right? An SSRI is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And there are two, I don't remember if we talked about this last time, but I'll say it again if we did. So there are two tiers of SSRIs. There's the first generation SSRIs and the second generation SSRIs. The first generation SSRIs were less selective, right? But they were pretty broadly applicable in the population and pretty effective. However, they tended to come with lots of side effects because they weren't very selective. So side effects of SSRIs like Paxil, Prozac, and Zoloft, the first generation ones, where they may cause release from depression, but also possible were 40-pound weight gain, kill off your sex drive, anhedonia, which means I don't really care about anything, right? Not only am I not depressed, I am not actually feeling any emotions. So that's extreme, of course, and not everyone's going to experience that. And then they came out with the second generation. The second generations are more selective, but also not as broadly useful, right? Because they don't work on everyone. They're more selective. And those are like Celexa and Lexapro and some other ones I can't think of. Those are the second generation ones. They had fewer side effects, but they didn't work. So let me just your user's manual for your brain. Let's say that you decided that you were depressed or anxious enough to consider using SSRIs. What do you try first? Second generation. How about dosage? Lowest dosage possible of the second generation. And then you remember that because you were smart and you were continuing to educate yourself, you remember that nobody tested your serotonin levels, right? Okay. And you realize that you need to be engaged in the process with your medical care professional, right? So nobody tested your serotonin levels. Why? Is that malpractice? No, they can't test your serotonin levels. What they do is you self-report to me that you have been feeling depressed and anxious. I run through a couple of possibilities and I say, okay, let's try SSRIs as your medical professional. And you say, cool, and you think that they actually know what the hell they're doing. They're just experimenting on you, that's all, and because you asked them to, right? But you need to engage in the experiment, right? And you need to be a good scientist, and you need to take notes, and you need to say, okay, I'm taking this dosage of this drug, and I'm going to take it for this long, and I'm going to say during the first week, I was feeling depressed or anxious maybe 7 times a week, right? 7 days a week. And then I am taking it for 3 weeks, and I see if it's gone down to 5, right? Or if the severity of the symptoms has gone down. And then at 6 weeks, is it down to 2, or the severity is more manageable. And then you take that information and you go back and you say, this dosage seems appropriate, inappropriate, I don't like this drug, I do like this drug, those kinds of things. And then you also, because you've got an owner's manual for your brain, you also realize that if you've been taking drugs that mess with your receptors for a long time, you have run the possibility of downregulating your receptors. And so you be very careful about how you get off those drugs, right? Because if you've been taking SSRIs for a long time and they have been having the mimic of dumping more more serotonin in your synapse, and then you're like, I'm done, I'm going off cold turkey. No, you've thought you were depressed before. You can be suicidal because of going off of SSRIs massively. And the problem, of course, this is the kind of thing I think that people should be educated in high school, right? Like, okay, you can teach me, the Pythagorean theorem, but how about teach me why I shouldn't go off SSRIs really quickly? So anyway, I like to engage in the process with my medical care professionals. And I have my notes. I have a little app on my phone. I give myself smiley faces when I'm having a good day, angry faces when I want to punch somebody. And then I'm like troubleshooting that crap. I'm like trying to reverse engineer a happy, healthy brain. Well, hasn't worked yet. Okay, so the other thing about serotonin is this. Because of serotonin's impact on sensory and motor activity, every single hallucinogen we know, save salvia divinorum, which has a different mechanism, LSD and psilocybin and all of the artificial, there's all kinds of crazy hallucinogens out there that they can make in the lab. Those are usually serotonin agonists. And they act all over the brain. They're usually relatively lipid soluble. They have pretty quick efficacy. And they make you hallucinate because they act at your serotonin synapses in your sensory area of your brain. And they usually get a bunch of the symptoms. Like they will depress your appetite. They're going to make you super happy. They're going to make you hallucinate sort of all simultaneously. Like LSD and psilocybin. Do you know psilocybin? Mushrooms, exactly. Yeah, it comes from mushrooms. MDMA has similar activity. It doesn't act in all the same places, but if you take enough MDMA, you can have some hallucination. Not the same as LSD, but some hallucinations occur. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so hallucinations are distinctly possible. By the way, you can have a little bit of hallucination if you're taking really high doses of SSRIs, too. Has anybody else ever experienced that? So they can make you like have little flashes, not like animals, right? But you're like, oh, it's super pretty and bright over there, and there's sparkly lights. And I'm like, it's interesting your brain's doing that. They do. The brain zaps. Nobody else wants to share that they're crazy. That's fine. I'm crazy enough for all of us. And SSRIs can cause these little brain zaps, and you've got like crap going on back here, and you're like, well, I'm not bored. It's fine. Okay. So, and then the third one. I'm not telling you this one because I know very much about it, but because I suspect it's going to be important in the future. This is also a biogenic amine, and this one is histamine. And you met histamine as a paracrine agent related to inflammatory responses, right, and allergic responses. But they figured out that histamine is a really common neurotransmitter in the hypothalamus. And since the hypothalamus is pretty damn important, I suspect in the future that we will be learning more about histamine's functionality in the brain. But we don't really know very much about it yet. It just fits into that category. Go ahead.
So that makes sense with Benadryl, making people tired and hypothalamus controlling really basic functions like sleep and sex.
Only if Benadryl has a way to get in there. I don't know the answer to that one. It would make sense if Benadryl was lipid soluble and could get into the brain. That would make sense. But I don't know enough about this to say that. Go ahead.
What is taking a muscle relaxant instead of an SSRI?
Muscle relaxants usually work with GABA, so we're about to do GABA. So hold on to that one for just a second. Okay, so the next category are the amino acids, and these, instead of being derived from an amino acid, are just an amino acid. Like you could just as easily use it as part of a protein. So you're going to have 2 excitatory ones and 2 inhibitory ones. And these are all CNS. I don't know that they're never in the PNS, but I don't know any PNS functions of these. So you got 2 excitatory amino acid neurotransmitters. Let me show you these guys. So these are just straight amino acids, like they could be part of a protein. Glutamate and aspartate are the excitatory ones, and GABA and glycine are the inhibitory ones. And so you can see the approximate size of them. So let's talk about these. Excitatory amino acid ones glutamate and aspartate. It seems as if these have a lot in common, but I was reading functionality. We know more about the functionality of glutamate. It's cerebrum. This one is brainstem and, I remember, yeah, spinal cord and brainstem mostly. But they interact with, a lot of times, the same receptors, only this one usually has a greater affinity for the receptors. So they usually get lumped together. So glutamate, this one has a really interesting functionality that I just finished reading about. That's part of the reason I changed your notes, is that glutamate seems to facilitate neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is your brain's capacity for forming new synapses and also potentially forming new neurons. There are parts of the brain that can form new neurons, and it seems to be facilitated by this chemical. So it's important for neuroplasticity in the brain. It also is a really sort of massively abundant excitatory neurotransmitter. So when you have massive amounts of it, it can make you really, really jazzed up. And we found that out because this is one of the chemicals that is implicated in ADHD. It's also one of the chemicals that you manipulate when you use ADHD medication and or any other methamphetamine. So implicated in ADHD, have you guys heard of the drug PCP? It used to be called Angelus. Nobody really uses that anymore, or maybe they do. I don't know. Yeah, do they still? Some of you guys work with drug treatment, so I don't see it being as common as it was before. This is the drug to help you understand what glutamate does. PCP interacts at glutamate receptors, and this is the drug that you might have heard of if you hear like, oh, there's a 150-pound dude and it took 8 cops to bring him down, or somebody decided they could fly, right, off the top of a building. So it makes you kind of aggressive, not sleepy, have sort of an unrealistic expectation about your own personal capacity. Like, I mean, you're 10 foot tall and bulletproof, right? And so that is angel dust or PCP. There's lots of people who kill themselves using that, sort of accidentally or incidentally using that. But I don't see it around very much anymore. It was like 70s and 80s where people were using it.
Mix it with marijuana.
Really? Why? Because you don't want to get sleepy?
So my mom was sort of a hippie, and she.
My mom was a super hippie.
She came of age in the 50s and the 60s, and she smoked, not on purpose, smoked a joint with a place of PCP.
Oh.
And she said it was like completely debilitating. Like she just sat there for about 6 hours. I was like, well, that sounds like not very fun. And she was like, everybody else was fine. I was just sitting there in a beanbag chair, not having the time of my life. And then I've had friends who in the 2000s smoked, in like early 2000s would smoke.
I wish somebody needs to educate me about that. If like why would you put that in weed?
Or you can smoke it with tobacco. You dip it.
Just like, well, it doesn't sound like it made her up.
No, she hated it.
Oh, interesting. So anyway, that's PCP. Ketamine. Have you guys heard of ketamine? Okay, so ketamine is a horse tranquilizer, or you can use it for a party drug, although it just makes you sit on a beanbag for 45 minutes. So like you're partying, it's just that you don't look like it to anybody else, right? This is like an internal party, all that's happening. It's a glutamate antagonist, and it's a massive glutamate antagonist, so it like antagonizes the excitatory activity of your brain. Pretty much turns off most of your sensory function. You don't do a whole lot of interaction, but there's a whole bunch of stuff happening internally. But it doesn't last for very long. It's really, by the way, ketamine is really, really hard on your urinary system. You clear it through your kidneys, and it can cause kidney failure. So be very, very careful about ketamine. A lot of people think that because it's short term, it probably can't cause as much damage, but it actually causes massive kidney failure. It's one that you would not want to use frequently. It's also really expensive, super duper expensive. What?
Is it the same effect on the kidneys and horses?
They don't use it frequently though. If you're using a horse tranquilizer, you're using it like acutely, right? Not chronically. And it doesn't cause kidney failure acutely in humans either, but when people start on ketamine, they tend to use it very frequently, right? And they don't know what they're doing to themselves. So anyway, that's ketamine. And then the other thing is that it's implicated in ADHD. Parkinson's disease, the motor function of it is related to dopamine, but it also has some glutamate functionality as well. Okay, aspartate, that one. is active in the brain, spinal cord and brainstem. It's excitatory. It has a lesser affinity for a lot of the same receptors as glutamate, so they interact with sometimes the same receptors. Now, the only reason I'm going to tell you this is because it might become important in your future, is that the receptors for glutamate and aspartate are not named the way that you would want them to be. They're called NMDA receptors because of the thing, the chemical that they actually look like. Why do you care? The reason you care is because if, for instance, you start running into ADHD medication, they'll tell you it's an NMDA receptor agonist or antagonist or whatever. And I just want you to know that that actually has to do with the neurotransmitter that you've learned so that you can apply that when you see it in the future. Does that make sense? I won't make you memorize what NMDA stands for. Most of the rest of the receptors, the name makes sense. Okay, now GABA, the inhibitory inhibitory amino acid neurotransmitters, GABA and glycine. This is kind of the same situation. We know way more about GABA. This one is more spinal cord and brainstem, and this one is more cerebrum. GABA is, in addition to these three, it is my other favorite neurotransmitter. Because GABA is your chill out neurotransmitter. It is nature's Valium. It's what you feel when you can actually feel your blood pressure dropping. So if you've had a really stressful day and you get around someone that you can talk to and you feel your blood pressure dropping, or you pet your dog, right? Causes you to release GABA and also oxytocin, and calms you down. Or if you have a sip of wine, can you feel the drop in your blood pressure? Can you feel your muscles relax and the drop in your blood pressure? You don't even have to have a glass, right? It's just like a sip and you can feel GABA. That is because alcohol enhances the activity of GABA in your brain. So this is your chill out neurotransmitter. I think that we spend a lot of time in this day and age chasing GABA, right? Because we're so overstimulated that GABA feels amazing when it occurs. So the clinical connection here is really important. It's a big, big, important clinical connection. And that is that most of the anti-anxiety drugs that we're using, and I'm talking about not serotonin-based anti-anxiety drugs, but GABA-based anti-anxiety drugs, like Valium, Klonopin, clonazepam, Xanax. That's a group of drugs called the benzodiazepines. They're often just abbreviated benzos. And they enhance GABA's action massively. They have a massive enhancing action on GABA. And so they're really effective as acute anti-anxiety drugs. What do I mean, acute anti-anxiety drugs? I mean, if I am having a panic attack or my anxiety is really ramping up and I can pop one of those, then I can counteract the effect by causing my GABA receptors to work a lot better, my GABA synapses. But here's the problem with these. These are supposed to be prescribed for acute use and not for chronic use. And they are prescribed really inappropriately in this country. In most Western countries, you can't have more than a 30-day prescription for benzodiazepines. And sometimes they will force you, I mean, my doctor is really like rigid about this, but most of them aren't. I can have 30 days of benzos over a 90-day period. That's the most that I will be able to get. But a lot of people prescribe them because they're anti-anxiety. You can see how sometimes they can help with sleep, right? Because half the time most of us can't sleep. It's because your brain will shut the hell up. Makes you think about that dumb thing that you said that one time 5 years ago, right? Yeah. And obviously everybody still hates you. I know that they're still thinking about that. Because that's all everybody does, right? They sit around and think about us, right? As my most useful therapist told me one time, she's like, nobody's thinking about you. As soon as you leave the room, nobody is thinking about you. They're talking about you. I was like, oh my God, that's so comforting. Really? They're like, they're too busy thinking about them constantly. Okay, so GABA and the benzos. Here's what happens with the benzos is that in this country they have started giving them as just sort of a daily medication. And I bet you know somebody who's taking Klonopin or clonazepam daily. Here's the problem with that. It is really, really dangerous. They are incredibly habit-forming. And the habit forming doesn't necessarily have to do with the dopamine, but it has to do with the downregulation of your GABA receptors. So here's what happens. I start taking benzodiazepines, and I don't just take them once. I take them for 3 weeks straight. right? Every day, and even at high doses sometimes. But the problem is that anytime I don't have the benzos in my system, I want you to think about how my GABA receptors would react to normal levels of GABA. They're not going to react, right? Because I have like enhanced the activity of GABA for so long. So anytime you're not taking them, your anxiety goes crazy, right? So you have this bounce back effect. And so what does that make you do? You take more, exactly, right? And then you're like, oh no, I'm not going to take any. And then your anxiety goes crazy and then you take more. And so you basically end up teaching your brain that it needs these drugs in order to basically have any level of chill whatsoever. So why is that particularly dangerous? Well, the danger is not so much in just using these, it's in the habit formation and the fact that if you try to get off of them and you don't have your chill out chemical, your brain has a seizure. So these are dangerous enough drugs. They are really habit forming. It's very dangerous to go off them cold turkey. And they tend to make the problem that they medicate even worse if you use them regularly. And what do I mean regularly? You can get addicted to these things in 2 weeks by regular use. So how serious is this? It's serious enough that here in Utah, where you know we don't like to give anybody any kind of fun drugs no matter what, if you go into the jail system or the prison system here in Utah, they don't have to give you opioids or opiates because the withdrawal from the opioids or opiates won't kill you. You're going to want to die, but it won't kill you. But they have to keep you on benzos because it causes seizures and it can kill you dead. And they have to keep you on benzos the entire time unless they can actually withdraw you from the benzos. So they're really, really serious and people use them really inappropriately. And my sister-in-law lives in Switzerland, and they will not prescribe benzos unless they've tried every other possibility. And then they get like, 2 per week, is as many of benzos as you can get. So it's an interesting one. But I have personal experience with this because my husband accidentally got addicted to these just by normal use for sleep. And it took him 2 years to get off of benzodiazepines. And he thought he had an autoimmune disorder and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so that's GABA. What does alcohol do? Alcohol enhances GABA's action as well, although slightly differently. You have to be very careful about doubling up on your GABA drugs, though. If you're taking benzos and alcohol, also zolpidem or Ambien is partially GABA-based. So if you combine a bunch of those, you can end up basically depressing your respiratory system, kind of like opiates do. And don't mix opiates in with those either, because that's terrible. You can stop breathing. Okay, glycine is active in the brain, in the spinal cord and brainstem. Have you guys heard of strychnine? Strychnine's a poison. Strychnine is a poison because it's an antagonist for glycine, and it actually inhibits the brainstem and spinal cord function, and ends up you just stop breathing with that one. Okay, so the last one that we'll do today is just briefly. I'll tell you about these, and then we'll talk about the rest of them next time. The purines. So you probably heard that word before, purines and pyrimidines, when you're talking about nucleic acid structure. Okay, so you got your A's, T's, G's, and C's. Well, the A's, adenosine diphosphate, and adenosine triphosphate. Those are all purines. And I know it sounds weird, but we use ATP as a neurotransmitter. We use ADP as a neurotransmitter, and adenosine as a neurotransmitter. So ATP, ADP, and adenosine. ADP, adenosine. Okay. And why do you care? The reason you care about that one is because caffeine is an adenosine antagonist. Adenosine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, right? And caffeine is an antagonist to an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which is what allows it to wake up your central nervous system. Good? Okay, we will stop there for today. I'm not going to do a quiz until Thursday of next week. But you can sort of see how you can start organizing your neurotransmitters. By the way, I promise you that I will never ask you to recognize a neurotransmitter from a picture. Right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Biochemistry, they'll make you do that, though.
So you're not going to get